Hey, welcome back. If you're here to fall asleep, you found the right place. If you're here because you love Gravity Falls and you want to know about all the things that were quietly cut, silently erased, and carefully buried before the show ever reached your television screen, then you found exactly the right place too. Either way, get comfortable. Pull your blanket up, close your eyes whenever you're ready, because tonight, we're going somewhere very specific. We're going to sit with the version of Gravity Falls that most people never got to see. The cuts, the banned scenes, the deleted moments, the episodes that aired with pieces of themselves missing, the dialogue that was rewritten at the last second, the characters whose relationships were softened, flattened, or removed before the public ever had a chance to meet them the way their creator intended. There is a whole shadow version of Gravity Falls out there, and tonight we are going to walk through it very slowly, very softly, and very completely. So just breathe. The forest is quiet outside. Somewhere a pine tree is leaning in the wind. Somewhere the mystery shack is dark and still. Let's begin. Section 1. The shape of a show that almost looked different. Before we get into specific cuts and country-by-country alterations and leaked emails, and the great censorship battles that Alex Hirsch fought with Disney over the course of 4 years, it's worth taking a moment to think about what a children's animated show actually is when it's being made. Because the version you watch, the version that lands on your television or your streaming service or your laptop screen at 2 in the morning while you're trying to fall asleep, that version is never the only version that existed. Every show you've ever loved started as something messier, stranger, more complicated than the thing it eventually became. Scripts get rewritten. Scenes get cut because they run long. Dialogue gets softened because someone in a boardroom decided it was too sharp. Characters get adjusted because of legal concerns or cultural sensitivities or the vague institutional anxiety of a corporation that sells happiness for a living and cannot afford to offend anybody, anywhere, in any market, at any time. For most shows, this process happens quietly. The cuts disappear, the unused scenes evaporate. The fight between the creator and the network stays internal, and the audience never knows that the version they watched was already a compromise. But Gravity Falls is not most shows, and Alex Hirsch is not most showrunners. Because what Hirsch did, especially on the occasion of the show's 10th anniversary in June of 2022, was something remarkably unusual. He opened the door. He pulled out actual emails, real correspondence between himself and Disney's Standards and Practices Department, dated back to September 2011, going line by line through scenes and dialogue and character interactions that S&P wanted changed or removed or softened or eliminated entirely. And he read them out loud. And he shared his responses. And the picture that emerged from those emails and from years of interviews and public statements and fan research was the picture of a show that existed in multiple versions simultaneously. The version that aired in the United States, the versions that aired in other countries, the version that Hirsch wanted to make, and the version that Disney would have been perfectly happy with if he'd never pushed back on anything at all. Tonight, we are going to sit with all of those versions. We're going to visit each one in turn, gently, carefully, with the kind of slow attention you only bring to things when the room is quiet and the hour is late and there's nowhere else to be. We're going to go from the unaired pilot, the very first flickering test version of the show, all the way through the final episode, stopping at every place where something was cut or changed or removed. In the US, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, in the Middle East, in Russia, and in the one country that decided the whole show was simply too much for anyone to watch at all. There's more here than most people realize. There's more here than I think even dedicated fans have sat with all at once in sequence, with the full weight of each cut understood alongside all the others. So let's do that. Let's just let it wash over us. The room is quiet. The pine trees are still. Somewhere in the forest, something wild and strange is watching. Take a breath. After the first section, before we go any further, I just want to pause and say, if you're watching this right now, wherever you are in the world, drop a comment below and tell me exactly where you're tuning in from. What time is it where you are? Are you in bed? Are you on a couch somewhere? Is it raining? I love knowing where everyone is during these videos. And while you're down there, if you're enjoying this kind of deep dive, the subscribe button is right there, and it genuinely means everything to this channel. It takes 2 seconds, and it makes a real difference. Okay, back into the woods. Section 2. What is censorship in animation, really? Censorship is a word that gets used a lot in fan communities, and it tends to get used in a way that's a little blunt, a little one-size-fits-all. Someone cuts a scene because it's too violent, and fans say censorship. A streaming service edits a character's design, and fans say censorship. A show has to redub a line of dialogue because a word slipped through, and fans say censorship. And technically, all of those things are censorship, but they're not all the same thing, and the differences between them matter quite a bit when you're trying to understand what actually happened to Gravity Falls. There are really several distinct categories at play here, and it's worth naming them before we get into specifics, because knowing which category a particular cut falls into tells you something important about why it happened and who was responsible. The first category is network-level domestic censorship. This is what happens inside the production of a show before it ever airs, when the network's own standards and practices department reviews scripts and rough cuts and sends notes requesting changes. This is the category that generates the most interesting material in the Gravity Falls story, because it's where Alex Hirsch was directly involved in a back and forth with Disney's S&P team, and where his responses are on record. These are the cuts that happened in the American version of the show, the cuts that affected every viewer regardless of where they lived. When S&P asked Hirsch to remove the word poop face and he pushed back, that was a domestic censorship battle. When they flagged a scene of Sheriff Blubbs putting his arm around Deputy Durland as potentially flirtatious and asked for a revision, that was a domestic censorship battle. These are the moments where the show that American audiences watched was already a compromised version of what Hirsch wanted. The second category is international broadcast censorship. This is where it gets genuinely fascinating from a cultural perspective, because it shows you how the same piece of content can be received completely differently depending on what country is airing it and what standards that country's Disney Channel is operating under. A word that's perfectly acceptable in a North American context might be flagged as offensive in Southeast Asia. A visual gag involving violence that's considered mild and cartoon-like in the US might be cut entirely for Middle Eastern audiences. A character making a reference to death might be perfectly fine for British viewers and completely unacceptable for certain markets in Asia. The international censorship of Gravity Falls is extensive, deeply specific, and in some cases genuinely illuminating about the cultural values being protected. The third category is streaming-era retroactive censorship. This is what happens when a show that's already been made and aired gets re-released on a streaming platform, and somebody at that platform decides that certain elements of the original broadcast version are no longer appropriate or legally concerning or too much trouble. This is how Grunkle Stan's Fez symbol got quietly removed from the Disney Plus version of Gravity Falls when the service launched in November of 2019. Not because of any new standard, not because of any community complaint, but seemingly because someone at Disney decided it was easier to just erase the thing than to deal with potential concerns about it. And the creator of the show found out about it by watching his own show on the new streaming service and noticing his character's hat was different. The fourth category, and the rarest one in this story, is outright banning. Not editing, not altering, banning. The decision by a country or a broadcast authority to simply not air a show at all because the totality of its content is deemed inappropriate for its intended audience. This is the category that Kenya falls into, and we'll spend time there when we get to it. But for now, I want you to just let those 4 categories settle in. Domestic, international, retroactive, and outright banning. Each one represents a different kind of decision made by a different kind of authority in response to a different kind of concern. And together, they form a complete picture of everything that Gravity Falls had to navigate just to exist in the world. Not just to exist as a good show, to exist at all. There's also something worth saying about the philosophy behind each category, because the reasoning isn't always what you'd expect. Domestic S&P censorship, for instance, is sometimes about protecting children, but it's often at least as much about protecting the network from liability. A single angry parent in a specific media moment can create enormous institutional headaches for a broadcasting company. The calculus of S&P review is not purely ethical, it's also deeply practical. What will generate complaints? What will make it into a news story? What will cause an advertiser to call? These questions produce a very specific kind of paranoia, the kind that flags the word poop face while allowing dimensional apocalypse, because poop face is the kind of thing a parent might write a letter about, while the apocalypse is the kind of thing parents actually want their kids to engage with in a safe fictional context. International censorship, by contrast, often reflects genuine, principled differences in what a society considers appropriate for children. The fireworks pixelation in Southeast Asia isn't performative or defensive in the same way. It reflects a specific regulatory judgment that images of fireworks being handled casually by children constitute a meaningful imitation risk. Whether you agree with that judgment or not, it comes from a considered position about child safety and media influence rather than from corporate anxiety about advertiser relations. Retroactive streaming censorship is perhaps the most philosophically confused of the categories, because it applies modern sensitivities to content that was already made, already aired, already absorbed by an audience, and that was presumably acceptable at the time it was created. When Disney Plus removed the Fez symbol from Stan's hat, they weren't protecting children who might never have seen the symbol. They were altering a historical record of a creative work without the creator's knowledge or consent. That's a different thing, ethically, from declining to air something in the first place. It's an act of revision, not prevention. And outright banning is the category that perhaps requires the least philosophical explanation, but the most honest acknowledgement. Sometimes a piece of creative work is genuinely incompatible with a given context, and the most coherent response is to say so directly, rather than to spend resources trying to edit it into compatibility. This doesn't mean the ban is always right, or that the incompatibility couldn't be addressed differently. It just means that sometimes the gap between what a thing is and what a context wants from it is too large to be bridged. All of these things happened to Gravity Falls, in varying degrees and combinations, across its 4 years of production and its decade of re-release. And the full story of how all of them intersected, how domestic censorship shaped the American version, how international censorship reshaped that already compromised version for dozens of other markets, how streaming censorship went back and altered even the versions that had survived all of that, and how one country concluded that no amount of alteration would be sufficient. That full story is what tonight's video is about. So settle in a little more, my. Find the position you'll be comfortable in for a while. The story has a lot of rooms to move through. The pine trees are still. There's a faint wind somewhere. Let the categories settle. Section 3, the unaired pilot. The show that almost wasn't every version of Gravity Falls that ever existed begins with a single piece of paper. Actually, a lot of pieces of paper. Post-it notes, specifically. Because that is how Alex Hirsch pitched Gravity Falls to Disney, by storyboarding the entire concept by hand on Post-it notes, pressed together into a rough visual sequence, and presenting it to Disney Channel executives as his vision for what the show could be. That pitch happened sometime around 2010, and it apparently worked well enough that Disney greenlit a pilot, but not the kind of pilot Hirsch made. The pilot that Disney commissioned was made by a small, low-budget flash animation studio in Canada, with a look and feel that was deliberately different from what Hirsch had in mind. That pilot, that rough, unfinished, never-broadcast test version of the show, is one of the most fascinating documents in the entire Gravity Falls story, because it shows you the first visible moment where the show that was imagined and the show that was produced began to diverge. And the divergence starts with something as simple as the look of the animation. The Canadian studio produced something that moved differently, felt different, sat differently on screen. The characters had a certain quality to their movement and proportion that Hirsch looked at and decided, no, this is not the show. When Gravity Falls was greenlit as a full series, Hirsch went out and hired his own team, specifically because he was not satisfied with what the pilot had produced. The pilot itself has a premise that's closely related to the first proper episode of the series, Tourist Trapped. which is to say that it involves Dipper and Mabel arriving in Gravity Falls, encountering something strange and dealing with it while Stan hovers in the background as a sort of chaotic, unknowable adult presence. But the specific details are different. The style of the humor is different. There are moments in the pilot that feel like early sketches of what the show would eventually become, rough drafts of character dynamics that would be refined and sharpened over the course of 40 episodes. For years, the pilot was unavailable to the public. It was a piece of found media, something fans knew existed but couldn't access. Then, in July of 2016, Hirsch announced something remarkable. As part of an unofficial fan-organized event called Cipher Hunt, a real-world scavenger hunt built around the mystery of Bill Cipher, with physical clues scattered across multiple countries. He promised that if the puzzle was completed, he would release the pilot online. The hunt was completed roughly a week later, and on August 3, 2016, Hirsch uploaded the pilot to a private website. The username to access it was Return Backwards. The password was ThePastAgain3. Even the act of releasing the pilot was encoded with the show's DNA. Even the keys to the locked door were a cipher. But here's the thing that fans only gradually came to understand. The version of the pilot that Hirsch uploaded was not the complete version. It was most of it, but not all of it. Over the years that followed, additional footage from the original pilot surfaced in unexpected ways. In June 2022, more footage was discovered on an animation reel from 2011 that had been sitting on YouTube since 2016, uploaded by an animator named Alfredo Casano, quietly waiting to be noticed. Then, in April 2024, the story took another turn. The full, uncut pilot, along with several other Disney original series pilots, was anonymously leaked online, posted to the internet as part of what appeared to be a larger Disney television animation data leak. The leak also included the original pitch Bible for the show, a document from 2010 that laid out the original plans for Gravity Falls in terms that are simultaneously recognizable and significantly different from what the show became. In the pitch Bible, Dipper is described as a conspiracy theorist from the very beginning, which tracks. Mabel is described as a cheerful romantic, also familiar. Stan is a money-grubbing con man running a tourist trap in a sleepy town in Oregon. The premise: two pampered city kids sent to spend the summer doing manual labor for their eccentric great-uncle, is all there. But the energy of it, in those early documents, feels more like a straightforward fish-out-of-water family sitcom, with the supernatural elements layered on top as a kind of adventure sauce, rather than the deeply integrated, thematically coherent mystery series that Gravity Falls actually became. There's also a detail in the pilot that ends up getting quietly changed in the transition to the broadcast series, and it's worth pausing on. In the pilot, there's a scene where a character has a tattoo on their arm that reads "Stabby," just the word "stab" in capital letters on the arm of a background character in a location that later becomes the skull fracture bar in the broadcast series. By the time the episode made it to television, that tattoo had been changed to "bats." Same letters, rearranged. Stab became bats. It's such a small thing, and it happened so quietly, and it tells you something important about the entire process. Even in the transition from pilot to broadcast, from the rough draft to the polished version, things were being trimmed, softened, rearranged. The show was being negotiated even before it aired. Something else about the pilot deserves attention: the overall visual tone. The pilot was made in Flash animation by an external studio and has a specific quality to it. The colors are slightly different, the proportions of the characters are slightly off from what we know. The backgrounds feel less layered, less atmospheric, less like the show is a place you could actually enter. One of the things that makes Gravity Falls as a broadcast series so distinctive as a piece of animation is the depth of its visual world. The feeling that the pine forests and the town and the mystery shack and the underground bunkers all exist in a coherent physical space with real weight and texture. The pilot doesn't have that quality. It has the right concepts in roughly the right arrangement, but the feeling of entering a real place hasn't arrived yet. Hirsch has been explicit in interviews about why he was unsatisfied with the pilot and why he assembled his own team when the show was greenlit as a series. He wanted a specific kind of visual language, a specific emotional register, and the pilot had neither. What it had was proof of concept, evidence that the characters worked, that the premise had potential, that the combination of mystery and comedy and sibling dynamics was viable. And that was enough to get the show made. The pilot did its job, even if the job it did was demonstrating that the pilot itself was not good enough. The Cipher hunt, through which fans ultimately got access to the pilot in 2016, is itself a remarkable piece of context for understanding the show's relationship with its audience. The hunt was not organized by Disney or by the official Gravity Falls production team. It was organized by Alex Hirsch, personally, as a gift to the fans who had spent years decoding the show's cryptograms and building community around its mysteries. The hunt involved physical clues placed in multiple countries, requiring international coordination among fans who had never met each other, who spoke different languages, and who were working together toward a common goal across time zones and national borders. It was, in miniature, an enactment of everything the show had been trying to do with its community of viewers. And the prize at the end of it was the very beginning, the version of the show that existed before it was the show. There's something deeply satisfying about that structure. You have to earn the origin. You have to travel through the present to get back to the past. You have to work in community across distance to reach the thing that existed before the community existed. The password was return backwards and ta the past again 3. Return backwards to the past again. 3. Turn the cipher 3 positions and you hear the beginning. The beginning is encoded in the same system the show used for everything else. The unaired pilot is not better or worse than what the show became. It's just different. It's a window into the moment before Hirsch had his own team, before the visual language of the show had been defined, before the cryptograms and the coded messages and the layered mythology had been developed into something coherent. It's the show in embryo, and the fact that it took a fan-organized international scavenger hunt, a leaked animation reel, and an anonymous data dump to finally give the public access to it is itself a kind of story about how tightly things get controlled, how much happens behind closed doors, and how much of what you love about a piece of media was shaped by decisions you never got to see. Rest with that for a moment. The faint sound of old animation playing in a dark room. Post-it notes stuck to a wall. Section 4. The Fez Symbol Saga, a hat, a secret society, and a legal nightmare. If you've watched Gravity Falls even once, you know the Fez. The red hat perched permanently on top of Grunkle Stan's head, the one that he wears at all times, the one that ties him visually to a long tradition of Fez-wearing characters in American pop culture. The kind of hat that says, in the language of cartoons, that this person is a jovial, eccentric, probably unreliable adult male of a certain vintage. The Fez is part of Stan's identity. It's part of his silhouette. You'd recognize him anywhere wearing it. But the Fez has a story behind it that most casual viewers never knew, and that story turns out to be one of the most quietly absurd censorship tales in the entire Gravity Falls saga. In the early episodes of the show, from Tourist Trapped all the way through to Boss Mabel, which is episode 13 of the first season, the Fez has a symbol on it. A crescent moon with a small fishtail curling from it. A simple, stylized image that looks vaguely exotic and vaguely symbolic and doesn't immediately call anything specific to mind. But to certain people in certain contexts, it called something very specific to mind. It called to mind the symbol of the Shriners. The Shriners, formerly known as the Ancient Arabic Order of the Nobles of the Mystic Shrine, and more recently rebranded as Shriners International, are an American Masonic fraternity that was founded in 1870. They're most visible to the general public through the hospital network they operate and through their parades, where members famously drive tiny cars while wearing red fezes. The fez is central to their identity and their symbol, a combination of a scimitar, a crescent, and an Egyptian sphinx head all overlaid on each other, is something that the early Shriners constructed from what Alex Hirsch himself later described in an interview with CBR as a random amalgamation of what white dudes in the 30s thought Middle Eastern culture looked like. They combined a scimitar, a crescent moon, and various other symbols into something that was meant to evoke an exotic mysticism, without particular accuracy or cultural specificity. What Hirsch's team did when designing the Fez symbol for Grunkle was create a simplified, abstracted version of that kind of iconography. Not a direct copy, but close enough that, when you put them side by side, the resemblance becomes apparent. And apparently, midway through Season 1's production, someone at Disney raised the question, what if the Shriners sue us? The symbol was changed. The new Fez design introduced in Episode 14, Bottomless Pit, features a more abstract fish-like shape, a design that is significantly less identifiable as a Shriner reference, and significantly less likely to prompt any legal action. And the old design? Simply never discussed, never explained in the show, just quietly different, as if it had always been that way, which it hadn't been. That would be a complete story on its own, but it becomes considerably richer in November 2019, when Disney Plus launched, and subscribers who had already watched Gravity Falls on Disney Channel started watching it again on the new streaming service and noticed something different, something extra. The Fez symbol, the original crescent moon symbol from the early episodes, had been digitally removed. Not replaced with the later design, not changed to something else. Just gone. A blank patch of red Fez where the symbol used to be. In every episode from the first season where the original symbol appeared, it had been erased, quietly and apparently without informing the show's creator. Alex Hirsch found out about it the same way the fans did, by watching his own show on Disney Plus. And his reaction was immediate, public, and genuinely funny. He posted on Twitter, his go-to platform for Gravity Falls-related commentary, and wrote that the geniuses at Disney Plus had removed the symbol for apparently no reason, but had then accidentally left it intact in the thumbnail images for every episode, because they couldn't keep track of what they were supposed to be concerned about that week. He followed that up by pointing out that the symbol was also still present in the opening credits of every single episode, embedded in the visual of the Fez during the theme song. A place that whoever edited the episodes had evidently not thought to check. There is something so perfectly, quintessentially Gravity Falls about this situation. A symbol is removed for mysterious reasons by a corporate entity that didn't bother to tell the creator it was happening. The creator finds out through his own fans. The symbol is still visible in the opening credits, untouched, hiding in plain sight. And Hirsch responds by publicly pointing out the inconsistency, effectively saying, "You missed a spot." The censors, as they would do time and again across the run of this show, managed to be simultaneously too aggressive and not thorough enough. But the Fez story also has a deeper layer, one that connects to the show's actual mythology in ways that make the erasure feel more significant than it might otherwise seem. Because the Fez symbol, the crescent moon with the fishtail, appears not just on Stan's hat, but as one of the 12 symbols on the zodiac, the ancient magical diagram that plays a crucial role in the Season 2 finale's attempt to stop Bill Cipher. The Fez symbol is, in the logic of the show, part of the fundamental architecture of Gravity Falls' magical world. Removing it from Stan's hat in the early episodes creates a strange, retroactive inconsistency. A gap in the visual language of the show that the story itself never accounts for, because the show never changed it, only the streaming platform did. You can feel the absurdity of this. The symbol is on the zodiac, where it matters enormously. It's in the opening credits where nobody thought to look. And it's erased from the episodes themselves, leaving this soft little blank space where Stan's secret society connection used to be visible, as if someone reached into the past with a digital eraser and tried to unmake something that was never really hidden. There's a coda to this story worth noting. After the Disney Plus controversy became public, and after Hirsch made his pointed tweets about the inconsistency of the edit, Disney and Hirsch apparently reached some kind of agreement. The exact nature of that agreement has not been publicly detailed, but reports suggest that the situation was resolved to both parties' satisfaction. What resolution looks like in this context, whether the symbol was restored, whether a different arrangement was made, whether both sides simply agreed to move on, is not entirely clear from the public record. What is clear is that the situation created enough public attention to require a formal response, and that response required Disney to acknowledge, at minimum, that a creator's show had been altered without their knowledge. That acknowledgement, small and procedural as it may have been, is not nothing. It is the institution being made to look at what it did. The fez stays on. The wind moves through the pine trees. Section 5. Disney's Standards and Practices Department. The Invisible Hand. Most people who watch television have never heard of a Standards and Practices Department. It sounds like something from a legal firm, or possibly from a manufacturing quality control process. And in some ways, it functions a little like both of those things. Every major broadcast network and most streaming platforms operate one. The job of a Standards and Practices team, sometimes called Broadcast Standards, or simply S&P, is to review content before it airs and flag anything that might violate the network's own content guidelines, applicable laws, potential advertiser concerns, or the sensitivities of particular communities that the network serves or wants to serve. For a children's animation network like Disney Channel, the S&P department occupies a position of significant power. They're not the last word on what airs. A sufficiently determined creator can push back, appeal, and occasionally win. But they're the first wall that content has to get past, and they have the institutional backing of a multi-billion-dollar corporation that has very clear ideas about what is and is not appropriate for its brand. When Disney S&P sends a note, it carries weight, and when Disney S&P sends a note saying, "Please revise," what they're really saying is, "We're not sure we'll approve this as is, and you should probably fix it unless you want to have a very long conversation." What Alex Hirsch did in June 2022 for the 10th anniversary of the show's premiere was extraordinary precisely because it was so rare. He didn't just talk about his battles with S&P in general terms, the way creators sometimes do when they're promoting something or looking for sympathy. He released the actual emails, time-stamped, specific, with exact page numbers referencing which pages of which scripts contained the offending material, and with his own responses typed back, sometimes polite, sometimes confused, sometimes dripping with a kind of very controlled exasperation that you can almost feel building over the course of months. The video he posted to Twitter opens with the statement, "The following are real emails from the Disney TV Standards and Practices Department." And then it just rolls. One note after another, going back to September 2011, a full year before the show even premiered. Hirsch was getting notes on scripts before a single episode had aired, before anyone in the public knew what Gravity Falls was, before the fandom existed, before the cryptograms had been decoded by anyone. The censorship machine was running on day one. What emerges from these emails is a portrait of an institutional sensibility that is, by turns, genuinely thoughtful, bafflingly inconsistent, and occasionally so disconnected from lived experience that it becomes hard to believe real people wrote these notes with serious intent. There are notes about individual words that S&P deemed too close to real profanity, words that most parents would consider completely acceptable in a children's context, words that would not cause any child watching to think anything other than that a cartoon character was being moderately rude. There are notes about cultural references that S&P feared might be misinterpreted as endorsements of things the network didn't want to be associated with. There are notes about character costumes. There are notes about the specific way characters hold each other. There are notes about background details so small and fleeting that you would need to pause the episode and zoom in to even notice them. Hirsch's responses vary. Sometimes he agrees without protest, apparently deciding that the fight isn't worth having over something small. Sometimes he offers alternatives. "I don't see what the problem with this is, but here are 3 other ways we could do it." Sometimes he just says no, flatly and simply, and waits to see if S&P pushes back. And sometimes he wins. The record of these exchanges is a record of a creative person navigating an institutional system, picking his battles, giving ground where he felt he could afford to, holding the line where he felt he couldn't. It is, in miniature, the story of what it's like to make anything within a corporate structure that has interests that are not entirely aligned with your own. One of the things that makes the emails so fascinating is the specificity of the concerns they raise. S&P was not reading these scripts as a viewer would. They were reading them as a kind of threat detection system, scanning for anything that could conceivably generate a complaint from a parent, a community group, an advocacy organization, or a foreign broadcaster. The question they were asking was not, is this appropriate for children in any holistic sense? The question was, could this single moment, stripped of all context, generate a complaint? And when you're asking that question, almost anything can be a problem. A word can be a problem. A hand gesture can be a problem. A hat symbol can be a problem. A scene of two older women sitting together in a diner can be a problem. There's something worth sitting with in that. The version of Gravity Falls that you watched, the version that felt bold and dark and fearless and willing to go places that children's animation rarely goes, that version existed because Alex Hirsch kept pushing. The show that felt like it had no guardrails was, in reality, constantly navigating guardrails. The darkness that felt organic and unforced was, in reality, the darkness that survived the process, the darkness that made it through the filter. Which means the actual version of the show, the one Hirsch was trying to make, was presumably darker still, more specific, more willing. And we only have fragments of that version in the form of deleted scenes and leaked storyboards and things Hirsch has mentioned in interviews over the years. But the fragments are enough to tell us something important. The show you love was the result of a fight, and the fight was real. Now let me say something about the dynamics of how these fights actually work in practice, because I think it helps you understand what you're looking at when you look at the emails. The S&P process is not adversarial in the traditional sense. The people at S&P are not enemies of the show. They're not sitting in a room somewhere hoping that Gravity Falls fails. In many cases, they genuinely like the show, admire the craft of it, understand what it's trying to do. But they're operating within an institutional role that gives them specific responsibilities, and those responsibilities occasionally put them in direct conflict with the creative vision of the show's maker. The notes that come back from S&P are formal documents. They have page numbers. They reference specific line numbers within specific drafts. They use the language of professional correspondence, which means they're polite and specific and often hedged in ways that obscure the underlying cultural judgment being made. When S&P says, "Please revise the scene of the two old ladies kissing as it is not appropriate for our audience," they're using a bureaucratic construction, "not appropriate for our audience." That sounds neutral, but is doing the work of concealing an actual position, which is, we are not comfortable with same-sex content in a children's show because we are concerned about the reaction of certain parents in certain markets. And Hirsch knew that. He knew what the neutral language was concealing. That's why his response to the "please revise" note on the two old ladies was a single word. Why? Because why forces the neutral language to give way? If the only answer is because two women are kissing, then the note has to acknowledge explicitly that this is the concern. And corporations are very reluctant to acknowledge certain things explicitly because explicit acknowledgments create records, and records create accountability. In several of the documented exchanges, Hirsch's tactic is essentially the same. He pushes for a reason. He asks the question that requires the bureaucratic language to mean something concrete. Sometimes this works, and the note gets revised or withdrawn. Sometimes it doesn't work, and the note gets escalated. The wins are small and specific. The losses accumulate quietly. What strikes me most about the emails, reading through the patterns of them, is how much creative energy Hirsch was spending on these negotiations, instead of on the show itself. Every note that required a response, every fight that had to be carefully calibrated, all of that was time and mental energy that wasn't going into writing and directing and voicing and animating Gravity Falls. The show got made despite the friction. But imagining what the show might have been if that friction hadn't existed, if the energy that went into explaining why poop face was an acceptable word had gone into something else instead, is a genuinely interesting exercise. The show you love was the result of a fight, and the fight was real. Section 6, The Language Wars. Every word they tried to kill. One of the most immediately surprising things about the Disney S&P emails, when Hirsch released them in 2022, was the amount of attention given to individual words. Not to scenes, or to concepts, or to the implications of certain storylines. To words. Specific, isolated words that an adult might use around children without a second thought. Words that parents across America say in front of their kids every single day. Words that are not profane, not obscene, not offensive by any reasonable standard, and yet which Disney's Standards and Practices Department flagged as potential problems. Let's talk about poop face first, because it is both the most absurd example and, in some ways, the most instructive. In one of the scripts for Gravity Falls, Mabel, cheerful, enthusiastic, sweater-wearing, pig-loving Mabel, was written as calling someone a poop face, and S&P sent a note. The note read, essentially, please revise poop face, as it comes across as a replacement for a different, more offensive compound word ending in face. The note then explained that a previous instance of Mabel saying poop, poop, and butts in a different episode had come across as more childlike and therefore less problematic. Hirsch's response, which he read aloud in the video, can be summarized as, I disagree because no child watching this show is going to hear poop face and interpret it as a substitute for a word they probably haven't heard yet. This is a word that a 10-year-old thinks is funny because it has the word poop in it. The joke is that it's a silly insult. That's all it is. And he pushed back. Whether he won or lost that particular fight isn't entirely clear from the public record, but the fact that the fight was necessary, that someone at Disney sat down and typed out a formal email explaining why the word poop face was potentially offensive, tells you something useful about the environment in which this show was being made. Then there's hoo-ha. The note from S&P on this one is direct and almost clinical. It has come to our attention that hoo-ha is a slang term for vagina. Please revise. Hirsch's response apparently acknowledged that this was technically true, but argued that in the context of the show, no reasonable viewer of any age would interpret the word that way, because it was being used in the sense of commotion or fuss. Whether this fight was won or lost is not clearly documented, but the note itself is striking. Disney S&P was running the word hoo-ha through a dictionary of anatomical slang and returning a result. Then there's crud, which was flagged for having an inappropriate slang definition. The inappropriate slang definition of crud, a word that most people associate with dirt, residue, or the vague physical mess that accumulates on things over time, is apparently a vulgar term that exists somewhere in the broader cultural vocabulary. Whether children watching Gravity Falls would know this definition is not explored in the note. The note simply identifies the existence of the definition and asks for a revision. Chub was flagged for having a sexual connotation. The context was a t-shirt worn by a background character that described a small dog as a chub pup, which is the kind of cutesy, slightly affectionate nickname that people give to slightly rotund small animals. S&P flagged it. Hirsch responded by pointing out that in context, the reference was clearly to the dog's physical stature, not to any secondary meaning the word might carry. He apparently offered some alternative wordings. The exchange resolved. There was a note about a character wearing a teddy bear costume. The concern was that the costume might, in the minds of certain viewers, evoke the furry community, people who dress up as anthropomorphic animal characters, sometimes in a sexual context. The note did not suggest that children watching the show would make this connection. It did not suggest that the connection was intentional. It simply flagged the existence of the possibility because S&P's job was to flag the existence of possibilities. The word geez, as in the exclamation of surprise or mild frustration, that countless adults and children say every day without any particular intent, was flagged as a potential abbreviation of Jesus, which S&P considered a religious reference that might be considered offensive. The word Holy Christmas was similarly flagged. Hirsch's response to at least one of these religious language notes was to point out that Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, a classic attraction at Disneyland, takes guests literally to hell. If Disney was comfortable with guests plunging into cartoon hell as part of a family attraction, perhaps a mild exclamation of surprise could be tolerated in an animated show. Whether he found this argument persuasive to S&P is not recorded, but it is a genuinely excellent point. There are also documented concerns around the word crud, which was flagged for having an inappropriate slang definition. The word crud, which in normal usage simply refers to dirt, residue, or mess, apparently has a secondary meaning somewhere in the cultural vocabulary that S&P considered potentially problematic. The note doesn't specify what secondary meaning is being referenced. It simply identifies the concern and asks for a revision. What's notable here is that the request is entirely disconnected from how the word is actually used in the episode. Nobody watching Gravity Falls hears crud and thinks of the secondary meaning. The word is being used to mean junk or nonsense in the completely standard way that the vast majority of English speakers have always used it. But the mere existence of the secondary definition, somewhere "yabani" in some context outside the show entirely, was enough to generate a formal note. There was also a note about the way a character's teddy bear costume might, in the imagination of certain viewers, evoke the furry community. The note did not suggest that children would make this connection. It did not suggest that adults watching would necessarily make it either. But the possibility existed, somewhere at the far edge of plausibility, and the possibility had to be addressed. Hirsch apparently found this one particularly baffling, which is understandable. The suggestion that a cartoon character in a teddy bear costume constitutes an allusion to a specific adult subculture is the kind of reach that reveals something about how the S&P review process can become untethered from any reasonable assessment of how actual viewers engage with content. What this pattern of word-level concern reveals, when you look at it all together, is not malice. It's not a conspiracy against the show or a vendetta against Alex Hirsch. It is, more precisely, an institutional anxiety, the anxiety of a very large corporation with a very valuable brand that makes most of its money from parents trusting it. The job of S&P was to ensure that no parent anywhere could turn on their child's cartoon and hear a word that could be considered offensive and then write a letter of complaint to Disney. And since the definition of could be considered offensive is essentially limitless when you're running every word through every possible interpretation, the result was an endless stream of notes about words that were, in any sensible reading of the show, completely innocent. It's worth knowing this as you think about the version of Gravity Falls you watched. Every line of dialogue that made it through was a line that Alex Hirsch fought to keep, or at least chose not to fight to remove. The voice of the show, Stan's gruff sarcasm, Mabel's exuberant silliness, Dipper's nerdy precision, survived the filter. But it survived imperfectly, with the occasional substitution and the occasional muting, and the complete picture of what the show wanted to sound like was slightly different from what it actually sounded like when it reached you. The character voices we know so well. Jason Ritter's earnest, slightly anxious Dipper, Kristen Schall's impossibly enthusiastic Mabel, Alex Hirsch's own extraordinary work as both Stan and Seuss, and dozens of background characters. All of these performances were landing in scripts that had already been negotiated, that had already had things removed and things adjusted. The performances are layered on top of compromise, and they're so good that you don't feel the compromise under them. But it's there, quiet and present, a foundation that was laid by negotiation rather than by pure creative intention. The quiet of the room settles back in. Somewhere, Stan is saying something, but you can't quite make it out. Something about dumb kids and their noise. Section 7. The Devil in the Details. Religious censorship in Gravity Falls. Gravity Falls takes place in a town where impossible things happen. Gnomes are real. Ghosts haunt the local convenience store. The journal of a six-fingered researcher catalogs dozens of supernatural entities with clinical precision. And the ultimate antagonist of the entire series is a triangular cosmic entity who draws power from fear and Ka, and whose name, Bill Cipher, is itself a reference to the coded writing systems that humans use to hide meaning from each other. This is not a show that shy away from darkness or mystery or the suggestion of forces beyond rational understanding. So it's notable, and slightly baffling, that Disney's Standards and Practices Department was particularly sensitive to religious language. Not theological positions, not explicit religious doctrine, not endorsements of any particular faith or critique of any other. Just language. The kind of language that people reach for when they need to express surprise or dismay or mild exasperation. And that has its roots in religious terms, but has, over decades and centuries of use, drifted so far from those roots that most people don't consciously register the connection anymore. Lucifer was flagged. The name. Just the name. Not used in a religious context, not presented as a character with theological significance, just the name appearing in dialogue in what Hirsch described as a spooky Halloweeny context, a reference that fit the tone of the episode without being intended as a serious statement about religion in any direction. S&P sent a note asking for it to be removed. Hirsch pushed back. He argued that, in context, the mention was clearly not intended to offend any religious group, and he made the Disneyland argument again. Mr. Toad's Wild Ride ends in a literal cartoon depiction of hell, complete with the devil and his associates, and Disney has been sending families there for decades, without apparent concern about religious sensitivity. If the physical theme parks could accommodate cartoon hell, surely the word Lucifer could appear in an animated show about supernatural mysteries in a Pacific Northwest town. It's not entirely clear from available records how that particular note resolved. What is clear is that the word Jeez, which S&P considered an abbreviation of Jesus, was also flagged, and that Holy Christmas was considered a potentially offensive religious phrase, and that the general pattern was one of extraordinary sensitivity to any language that could be traced, however distantly, back to a religious reference. The concern wasn't theological, it was reputational. Disney did not want letters from parents claiming that a cartoon on their network was taking their religion's name in vain. And so the notes went out, and the negotiations happened, and the version of the show that aired had slightly softer language than Hirsch's scripts originally contained. But the deeper irony here is worth sitting with, because Gravity Falls, as a show, is absolutely saturated with religious and esoteric symbolism. The Society of the Blind Eye chants Annuit Coeptis, Novus Ordo Seclorum, the Latin phrases from the Great Seal of the United States, printed on the back of every $1 bill, associated in conspiracy culture with the Illuminati and Freemasonry, and the idea of a hidden order governing the world. The zodiac that serves as the mystical diagram in the Season 2 finale is structured around 12 symbols that echo astrological and mystical traditions. Bill Cipher's triangular form, his all-seeing eye, his connection to dreams and the subconscious and the space between dimensions. All of this draws deeply on esoteric traditions, Masonic imagery, occult symbolism. The show is essentially a children's cartoon made entirely out of the kind of material that S&P was supposedly protecting audiences from. And yet a word like Lucifer or a phrase like Holy Christmas had to be fought over. The grand architecture of occult symbolism embedded in every visual element of the show sailed through apparently without comment, while individual words and individual lines of dialogue generated formal requests for revision. There's something almost beautiful about that inconsistency. The forest of symbols was fine. One of the trees was too much. Section 8. The Headhunter's Limerick, Nantucket versus Kentucky. Of all the specific censorship battles that are documented in the public record for Gravity Falls, the one involving the limerick in Headhunters is my personal favorite, because it illustrates something important about how censorship works in practice when the people involved are both paying very close attention to the same material and somehow arriving at completely different conclusions about it. Headhunters is the third episode of the first season. It's the episode where a wax figure of Grunkle Stan is destroyed, and Dipper decides to investigate the case as if it's a murder mystery, calling in the other wax figures as suspects. It's one of the funniest episodes in the first season, full of deadpan gags and a genuine mystery plot, and it features a brief moment where one of the wax figures, Wax William Shakespeare, begins to recite the opening line of a limerick. The limerick that Hirsch's script originally referenced begins with the words, "There once was a man from Nantucket." Those who know the tradition of adult limericks will recognize this as the opening line of what is probably the most famous dirty limerick in the English language, a poem that has existed in various forms since at least the early 20th century, and that is notorious for being impossible to complete in polite company. The joke in the script was that Wax Shakespeare was about to recite a dirty limerick, and the show would cut away before it got to the actual dirty part, leaving the punchline to the imagination of any adult viewer who recognized what was coming. S&P flagged it. The note came back. There once was a man from Nantucket was too closely associated with the famous dirty limerick. And even though the show would never complete the poem, the allusion itself was considered problematic. This is a genuinely thoughtful concern. The joke relies on the audience knowing the dirty limerick, which means the dirty limerick is effectively present in the scene even though it's never spoken. If you don't know it, the joke doesn't land. If you do know it, well, Hirsch's solution was elegant. He changed Nantucket to Kentucky. The limerick now began with, "There once was a man from Kentucky," which is not a famous dirty limerick. It's just a setup line. And because it's not a famous dirty limerick, the joke still works for people who know the Nantucket tradition and immediately recognize the substitution as itself a joke, a meta-reference to the censorship process, while being completely innocent for anyone who doesn't. It's the kind of solution that turns a compromise into something richer than the original, a word swap that becomes its own joke if you know to look for it. S and P then sent back another note. They were concerned that even Kentucky might still be interpreted as a reference to the dirty limerick, because it also began with a K sound. Hirsch's documented response to this note is, regrettably, not fully in the public record, but the fact that the note was sent at all tells you something about the thoroughness, some might say the thoroughgoing anxiety, of the process. The concern was not that Kentucky would remind anyone of anything. The concern was that someone, somewhere, might think about Nantucket, think about the dirty limerick, think about what rhymes with Kentucky, and follow that chain of associations to something objectionable. The version that aired uses Kentucky. The gag works. The wax figure begins the limerick, the scene moves on, and the joke lives in the gap between what was almost said and what's actually present. It's one of the most perfectly Gravity Falls moments in the entire series. A piece of humor that exists precisely at the boundary between what the show was allowed to say and what it wanted to say, with the boundary itself becoming part of the joke. Alex Hirsch was fighting for this show at every level, including the level of a single rhyming word in a throwaway scene in the third episode, and even that fight yielded something worth keeping. Section 9 of The Love God. Two old ladies and the kiss that never was. There is a moment that should exist in The Love God, a Season 2 episode from 2014, that doesn't. A small, sweet, completely casual moment that one of the show's storyboard artists put into a scene while working through a sequence in Greasy's diner, and that Alex Hirsch saw and immediately, as he put it, knew with complete certainty was going to turn into a huge fight with Disney. The Love God is the episode where Mabel discovers that a genuine, actual, literal god of love has arrived in Gravity Falls and decides to use his magic love potion to set people up. The episode is full of couples falling in love under the influence of supernatural matchmaking chemistry. It's a premise that requires the show to populate various scenes with people pairing off and reacting to sudden, overwhelming romantic feelings. The diner sequence involves a number of the town's residents being hit by the love potion's effects and falling for the person nearest to them. One of the storyboard artists, who was apparently simply drawing the most natural version of what various people falling in love in a diner looked like, made one of the newly in love couples two older women. Two background characters, elderly ladies, sitting at a table in Greasy's diner, falling for each other under the influence of magical love. It was, as Hirsch described it in his 2017 interview with the Mary Sue, sweet and casual. There was nothing emphasized about it. It wasn't a big deal in the narrative. It was just two older women who happened to be in the diner, who happened to fall under the spell along with everyone else. Their love was treated identically to every other pairing in the scene. Hirsch looked at it and thought, this is going to be a fight, but it shouldn't be a fight, so I'm leaving it in. The note came back immediately from Disney S and P. The scene of the two old ladies kissing in the diner is not appropriate for our audience. Hirsch's written response to that note was a single word: why? He has said in interviews that this response essentially broke the censors, that the question of why created a situation where S&P had to either articulate a coherent reason for flagging two women kissing that would hold up under scrutiny, or acknowledge that the reason was simply that it was two women kissing and Disney was not comfortable with that. And the implied answer to that question, the reason the answer couldn't be spoken plainly, was because acknowledging it explicitly would require Disney to formally state that same-sex affection was something they were actively removing from their content, which was a statement the corporation did not want on record. Hirsch lost the fight anyway. The scene was changed. One of the older women was replaced with an older man, making the couple heterosexual, making the scene unproblematic by the only definition of unproblematic that mattered to Disney S&P in 2014. The moment that was supposed to be there isn't there. If you watch The Love God right now, you see an old man and an old woman in the diner, not two old women. The version that was briefly animated, briefly real, lives now only in the original storyboards and in the documented memory of the people who worked on the show. What makes this particular cut so resonant, beyond the obvious unfairness of it, is the context in which it happened. A show about supernatural mysteries, a show with a triangular demon who commits acts of genuine narrative horror, a show that depicts death and mind erasure and dimensional collapse and the disintegration of a person's sense of self. This show was considered appropriate for children, but two older women falling in love in the background of a diner scene was not appropriate for children. The distinction being drawn was not about content maturity, it was about who gets to be in love. And this is the story that makes the later relationship between Blubbs and Durland, which we'll get to, feel so hard-won. Hirsch had been trying to get this particular kind of representation into the show for years before the finale. The two old ladies were not the first attempt. They were one battle in a longer war. A war that he kept fighting even after losing it, because he believed the show should reflect the world as it actually was, rather than the sanitized version of the world that the corporation wanted to present. The diner is quiet now. The table by the window is occupied by someone who wasn't supposed to be there. The moment that should have been there has been waiting for about 10 years to be acknowledged. Section 10. Sheriff Blubbs and Deputy Durland. The Long Fight for Love. Every time Sheriff Blubbs and Deputy Durland appear on screen together in Gravity Falls, there is a warmth between them that is unmistakable. The way Blubbs looks at Durland, with a kind of delighted, proprietary fondness, as if Durland is the most surprising and wonderful thing he's ever found, is different from how partners in a procedural context typically look at each other. The way Durland orbits Blubbs, seeking his approval, delighting in his company, laughing at things that Blubbs says even when they aren't particularly funny, suggests an emotional investment that goes beyond professional camaraderie. Fans of the show recognized it immediately. The internet knew, from early in the series, that there was something between these two characters, and Alex Hirsch knew it too, because Alex Hirsch was doing it on purpose. The documentation of Disney's S&P concern about the Blubbs-Durland relationship begins in earnest around the middle of the series. The email that Hirsch included in his 2022 release reads, "Please revise the action of Blubbs putting his arm around Durland, as noted in previous concerns. Their affectionate relationship should remain comical versus flirtatious." The "as noted in previous concerns" is significant. It suggests that this was not the first note about these characters, that S&P had been flagging their relationship for some time before this particular exchange. Hirsch's response was 3 words. "Nope. They're buddies. Chill out." What's fascinating about those 3 words is how much work they're doing. "They're buddies" is technically accurate. They are, on paper, co-workers who are also friends, law enforcement partners with an unusually warm relationship. The word buddies is exactly the kind of innocent, non-committal framing that allowed the scene to get approved without Hirsch having to concede anything he didn't want to concede. S&P approved the gesture. The arm went around the shoulder, and the show continued. The strategy Hirsch was employing, by Kudisa, maintaining plausible deniability while clearly encoding something in the subtext, is a classic approach to getting queer representation past corporate gatekeepers. It's sometimes called coding, and it has a long history in entertainment, particularly in earlier eras when explicit representation was impossible. The technique involves writing characters in ways that are fully legible to queer audiences as queer, while being interpretable by non-queer audiences as simply close friends. The disadvantage is that it can be erased. If the coding is never made explicit, the corporation can always claim ignorance. The advantage is that it gets through the door when explicit representation would not. Hirsch was clearly aware of this dynamic. He was also clearly frustrated by it, as evidenced by the public statements he made over the years about Disney's censorship of LGBTQ content during his time at the company. One of the most widely circulated quotes is from a Twitter post in which he wrote that Disney had privately told him to cut the gay scenes while publicly posting pride content on their social media, and described this as hypocrisy. The full quote is pointed and specific and was written at a moment when Disney was marketing Gravity Falls as part of a Pride collection on Disney+, the same streaming service where the show had been edited without Hirsch's knowledge, the same corporation that had told him explicitly in an email that he says still exists that he was banned from having LGBTQ characters in Gravity Falls. The finale changed things. In Weirdmageddon 3, Take Back the Falls, Blubbs and Durland are reunited after the apocalypse recedes, and they declare that they are mad with power and love. The show says it, not in subtext, in dialogue, spoken aloud, in the final episode. Hirsch has since confirmed that they are a couple. The relationship that S and P spent years managing and moderating was finally, explicitly acknowledged in the last episode, and Hirsch has noted in interviews that at that point, S and P did not send a note about it. Whether this was because the standard had shifted, or because the show was ending and the political capital needed to fight it one more time was no longer available, or because the censors were simply tired, whatever the reason, the scene aired. There's something almost elegiac about that. A relationship that spent years in the subtext, carefully coded, carefully negotiated, finally allowed to say its name in the last moments of the show's existence. As if the show had waited until it was sure it was ending before saying the thing it had been trying to say all along. As if it took the prospect of silence to give permission to speak. And it's worth thinking about what those years of subtext actually produced in terms of fan engagement. Because the Blubbs-Durland relationship, precisely because it had to exist in suggestion and implication rather than an explicit statement, became one of the things that Gravity Falls fans invested in most deeply. The game of reading the characters, of finding the moments, of assembling the evidence and arguing for its interpretation, was itself a form of community formation. Fans who decoded the relationship felt a sense of authorship over it, a kind of ownership that came from having seen something that wasn't being officially acknowledged. When the finale finally said it plainly, mad with power and love, the reaction wasn't just satisfaction at the confirmation. It was relief. The thing that had been known and seen and believed for years was finally, officially, undeniably real. And that relief is a specific kind of emotional experience that can only come from having spent time with the uncertainty, from having held the interpretation in your hands without official verification, and then having it confirmed. The censorship in this one specific case produced an emotional payoff that explicit representation from the beginning might not have achieved. The wait was terrible, the ending was worth it. That doesn't make the censorship right. The journey was unnecessarily long, and the obstacles were genuinely unjust. But the story it produced, a queer relationship that had to survive in the subtext of a children's cartoon, that fans kept alive through years of theorizing and hope, that finally got to declare itself in the last minutes of the show's existence, is a remarkable piece of emotional history. The relationship that spent years in the subtext finally got to say its name. Section 11. Southeast Asia, where violence gets pixelated and words vanish. International censorship is in many ways a more complex and more revealing story than domestic censorship. Because when Disney's own S&P department issues a note, it's operating from within a shared cultural context. They are Americans, reading a show made by Americans, for an American primary audience. The negotiations between Hirsch and S&P are, at least in part, negotiations about what American children and their parents consider acceptable. But when the show moves to international markets, the cultural context shifts entirely, and the results tell you something interesting about what different societies prioritize protecting their children from. The Southeast Asian broadcast of Gravity Falls, which aired on Disney XD Southeast Asia, featured a significant number of alterations, and the pattern of those alterations is worth examining in detail, because it doesn't match what you might expect if you assumed that different markets were just more or less permissive versions of the same standard. Fireworks were pixelated. In multiple episodes where Dipper and Mabel are shown with fireworks around them, the Southeast Asian broadcast blurred or pixelated the fireworks. This is because in certain Southeast Asian countries, laws governing the depiction of fireworks in media aimed at children are quite strict. based on concerns about children imitating what they see and potentially injuring themselves with actual fireworks. The pixelation is not about the dramatic content of the scene. It's about the specific visual of a firework, which is considered potentially imitable by young viewers. This is a genuinely different kind of concern from what American S&P was flagging. It's not about tone or appropriateness, it's about direct physical danger, as understood by a specific regulatory framework. Mabel getting shot by her own grappling hook was cut. The scene, which in the broadcast version plays as a slapstick physical comedy moment, Mabel turns a grappling hook on herself and is yanked off her feet, was removed from the Southeast Asian version entirely. Again, the concern appears to be imitation risk. Grappling hooks are devices that children could theoretically access, and a scene showing a character being struck by one could, in theory, inspire imitation. The logic is consistent with the fireworks pixelation, even if it leads to a different kind of cut. Scenes involving characters holding firearms, or even implying the possession of firearms, were cut. There is a scene in which Ford Pines joins Stan in threatening a bus driver by showing him a gun hidden in Ford's coat. The Southeast Asian version does not include this scene. There is a separate scene where Ford shows that he has a gun on his belt. That specific shot, just Ford's side showing the gun, was removed. In a show where creatures regularly threaten to destroy the world and a dimensional demon conquers reality itself, the specific image of an adult man carrying a firearm was the thing that required removal. Insults were systematically softened. In the Southeast Asian version, words like dork, idiot, knucklehead, and various other mild epithets were consistently removed or replaced. The concern here is about language modeling, the theory that children who hear characters using these words will then use them on each other. This reflects a particular view of the relationship between media and behavior that is more conservative than the American view, but not entirely unfounded in child development research. The interesting thing is that the Southeast Asian version thus cuts Mabel, calling someone a dork, while leaving in scenes where interdimensional chaos consumes reality. The logic is specific to the specific concerns, not to general maturity. The scene involving Robbie Valentino spray painting a word on a wall, a scene that in the American version uses a visual trick to imply that he's painted wieners while keeping the actual word off-screen, was cut entirely in certain international markets. There's also the connected scene where the Mattress King catches Robbie making what the Mattress King himself describes as lewd hand gestures. In certain international markets, both scenes were cut, removing not just the implied word and the gesture, but the entire comedic sequence that Hirsch built around them. What remains is a version of that episode where Robbie's vandalism just doesn't happen. And then there are the zombie heads. In Scary Oak, the second season premiere, there is a sequence where Dipper accidentally raises a horde of zombies, and the only way to defeat them involves Stan, Dipper, and Mabel singing in perfect harmony, a specific frequency that causes the zombies' heads to explode. The animation is deliberately cartoony, clearly not intended to evoke real violence, playing the exploding heads as a kind of gross comedy conclusion to the zombie problem. In certain international markets, this sequence was replaced. The close-up shots of zombie heads exploding were cut and replaced with a looped sequence of the zombies clutching their heads and shaking, which plays the moment very differently, as pain rather than destruction, and leaves the conclusion of the scene somewhat ambiguous. There's something philosophically interesting about pixelating fireworks in a show that contains dimensional apocalypses, and about cutting zombie head explosions from a show that features a character whose entire motivation involves the systematic destruction of reality. The censors weren't calibrating for overall darkness or overall maturity. They were calibrating for specific types of content that their specific regulatory frameworks flagged. And the result is a version of the show that has different textures in different places. Smooth, where the American version was rough. Rough, where the American version was smooth. Section 12. Latin America, muted screams and missing death. The Latin American broadcast of Gravity Falls operated under a different set of content considerations than either the American version or the Southeast Asian version. And the pattern of cuts and alterations reflects those differences in ways that are, again, culturally specific. One of the most distinctive alterations in the Latin American broadcast involves Preston Northwest, Pacifica's controlling and frankly terrifying father. In the episode Weird Mageddon Part 1, Bill Cipher, having arrived in physical form to claim dominion over reality, scrambles Preston Northwest's face as a casual demonstration of power, just reaches out and rearranges the man's face into something wrong, something that shouldn't be, because Bill is bored and powerful, and the suffering of humans is entertainment to him. It's one of the most disturbing moments in the entire series. Preston Northwest's reaction to having his face scrambled is to scream. In the Latin American broadcast, Preston Northwest's screams were muted. The face scrambling remained. The visual of the wrongness was preserved. But the sound of his terror was removed. You see it happen in complete silence, which is, in some ways, more disturbing than the original because the absence of sound in response to visible horror creates an uncanny disconnect that the human brain finds deeply unsettling. Whether this was the intended effect is unlikely, but the result is a version of that scene that is, paradoxically, more unsettling than the one that aired in North America. This is one of those fascinating accidents that censorship sometimes produces. The edit creates something more disturbing than the original through the mechanism of its own imprecision. The sound was removed to protect the audience from the intensity of Preston Northwest's distress. But the image wasn't removed because the image is more abstract, harder to categorize, less obviously connected to the category of graphic content. So you have the image with no sound. And the image with no sound is a man's face being silently rearranged by a supernatural entity while he opens his mouth in what should be a scream, but produces nothing. The silence doesn't soften the moment. It hollows it out. Religious references were removed entirely in certain Latin American markets. All references to death were softened or eliminated. In the episode where Dipper encounters a newspaper headline reading "Stan Pines Dead," the Spanish dub translates the headline as "El fin de Stan Pines," the end of Stan Pines, which maintains the drama of the moment without using the word dead. The concern about death language in children's programming reflects a sensitivity that is not unique to Latin American broadcasting. Many cultures have specific concerns about exposing young children to direct references to death. But the thoroughness of its application across the show's run creates a version where the stakes of various moments are subtly different, where the threat is implied rather than stated, where the word itself is absent. There's something philosophically interesting about a culture that will show you a man's face being rearranged by a triangle demon, but will not allow the word dead to appear in a newspaper headline. The visual horror is permitted. The linguistic directness is not. This is not hypocrisy, exactly. It reflects a specific theory of how children process distress, in which direct verbal statements about death are considered more harmful than visual symbolic violence. That theory has some support in developmental psychology. Children process abstract visual imagery differently from concrete verbal statements. Whether the calibration is right in this specific case is debatable, but the internal logic is not incoherent. Section 13. Kenya's ban. The show deemed too much. Kenya's position in the Gravity Falls censorship story is unique and requires a moment of genuine pause. Because where other countries altered scenes, muted lines, replaced images, and softened language, Kenya made a different decision entirely. Kenya banned the show. The reason given, according to available sources documenting this, is the show's adult-oriented humor. Gravity Falls was deemed too adult for its apparent target audience in a way that went beyond the capacity of individual edits to address. The humor of the show, its specific kind of layered comedy, designed to work on multiple levels simultaneously, offering different things to different audiences depending on their age and experience, was apparently considered inappropriate for broadcasting in a context where the primary audience would be children who might not have the cultural context to understand that the adult meanings were not the intended ones. This is, in some ways, the most honest possible response to what Gravity Falls actually is. The show is a children's show that is also, explicitly, a show for adults who loved children's shows and now want to revisit that feeling with the full weight of adult experience. The humor is layered by design. The darkness is layered by design. The show trusts its audience to handle complexity, and it handles the complexity differently at different ages. A child watching Gravity Falls sees one show, an adult watches a different one, and the decision to ban it outright, rather than to attempt to surgically remove the adult material from the child material, a process that would essentially require taking the show apart entirely because the two are inseparable, is arguably the most coherent possible response to that reality. There are only 40 episodes. They are densely constructed. Every element supports every other element. The humor and the horror are made of the same stuff. You cannot have the show without having the whole show. And that apparently was a problem. What it also means is that somewhere there are children who grew up in Kenya during the years when Gravity Falls was new and popular and being talked about globally, who heard about this show the way people hear about things, through friends, through international media, through the internet, and who couldn't watch it because their country had decided they shouldn't. That experience of being at the boundary of something that everyone else has access to is a particular kind of cultural situation, and it has its own texture. The show about secrets and things hidden in plain sight was itself a secret, in at least one corner of the world. The pine trees outside that corner of the world are the same pine trees they always were. The Mystery Shack doesn't care about national borders. But the broadcast signal stopped at the line, and on one side of it, children grew up knowing the show. On the other side, they didn't. And that asymmetry is part of the show's strange, specific, international story, Section 14, Zombie Heads, Axes, and Blood. The violence cuts. Violence in animation exists in its own special category of concern, one that is different from violence in live-action programming and different from violence in print. Animated violence carries a particular tension. It's clearly not real in the way that live-action violence can suggest real suffering. And yet the exaggerated, consequence-light treatment of violence in animation has its own potential for influence, particularly on young children who are still developing their understanding of cause and effect and the relationship between actions and their outcomes. The violence cuts in Gravity Falls, across both domestic and international versions, follow a pattern that's consistent with this general framework of concern, even as the specific decisions sometimes feel arbitrary when viewed in isolation. The scene where Dipper stabs the shapeshifter with an axe was cut in the Southeast Asian broadcast. The shapeshifter is one of the most genuinely frightening entities in the entire series, a being that can perfectly replicate any living form, discovered in an underground bunker where it has apparently been imprisoned for an extended period, which it initially presents as helpful and harmless, and then progressively reveals to be something else entirely. The climax of the episode involves Dipper confronting it with an axe, which is both a moment of genuine tension and a visual that's arguably more intense than most of what Gravity Falls shows. The cut makes a certain kind of sense in the context of children's media guidelines about weapons. The axe is a real-world weapon, held and used by a child character, in a way that is somewhat more naturalistic than the typical cartoon violence of the series. Mabel donating her blood was cut in certain international broadcasts. The scene in question is not violent. It's medical. Mabel voluntarily donating blood in a context that is presented as a positive, community-minded action. But certain markets' guidelines about the depiction of blood in children's media apply regardless of context, and the image of a child character having blood drawn was flagged as potentially distressing. Ford's gun made multiple appearances on the cutting room floor. The scene where Ford shows a hidden gun to threaten a bus driver, which is played for comedy, with Stan enthusiastically participating in what is, let's acknowledge, a wildly inappropriate way to resolve a bus dispute, was cut in markets concerned about the depiction of firearms, particularly in the hands of adult characters who are presented as trustworthy mentors to the children. Ford Pines is, for much of the second season, the intellectual authority figure of the show, the wise and experienced researcher who knows more than anyone else about what's happening in Gravity Falls. Having him brandish a concealed weapon at a bus driver sends a specific message about how trusted adults handle problems. And that message was considered inappropriate for young audiences in several markets. The Summerween trickster eating a child, or rather eating Gorney, the child background character who repeatedly appears in the town, was cut in certain international markets. Gorney getting eaten is one of the more memorably dark comedy moments in the first season. The trickster is a creature made of discarded Halloween candy, and Gorney is simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The moment is played for shock comedy, and in the American version it lands as a genuinely surprising and darkly funny beat. In the international versions that cut it, the scene ends before the eating, and the trickster's actions are not shown to have any consequence for Gorney, removing both the darkness and the joke. What's consistent across all of these violence cuts is the focus on specific types of visual content, actual weapons, blood, consumption, rather than on general narrative stakes. The show's story involves multiple characters facing potentially fatal threats, dimensional apocalypse, possession, and psychological torture. None of that is cut. What's cut is the physical specificity of certain violent acts. The logic appears to be that abstract stakes are less harmful than concrete depictions, that children can process the world might end more safely than they can process a person is holding an axe. Whether that logic is correct is a genuinely interesting question. It's not obviously wrong, but it does create a version of the show where the danger feels present, but its physical reality is sometimes absent. And that gap between felt danger and shown consequence has a slightly dreamlike quality that is actually, in the context of an ASMR video about this show, quite appropriate. There are additional Southeast Asian cuts worth lingering over. The scene where Mabel says, "Ew, I'd rather die, you creep," was changed to simply, "Ew." The reference to death, even in a hyperbolic, obviously non-serious context, the way a 12-year-old girl might dramatically declare she'd rather die than do something unpleasant, was flagged for removal. This is part of the broader pattern of removing death references that characterizes the most conservative international broadcasts of the show. The word die, said by a character who is in no real danger, in a tone of comic exaggeration, is still the word die. And in certain regulatory contexts, the mere presence of the word is the problem, regardless of intent. Stan's line in one episode, "Kids, if I die, make sure I get a bigger tombstone than Ford," was altered in certain markets to, "Kids, make sure I get a bigger tombstone than Ford." The conditional "if I die" was removed. What remains is a sentence about tombstones that is, stripped of its original context, somewhat confusing. Why is Stan talking about tombstones? The joke that Stan is characteristically competitive with his brother, even in the hypothetical scenario of his own death, that he is so committed to the sibling rivalry that he's making plans for it to continue posthumously, only works if you have the original conditional. Without it, you have Stan inexplicably requesting a large tombstone. This kind of collateral damage is common in censorship work. When you remove the element that's being flagged, you sometimes remove the context that makes the remaining elements coherent. The Southeast Asian audience watching that scene without the death reference is watching a scene that makes slightly less sense, that has a slightly awkward rhythm, a beat where something should have been and isn't. It's not ruined. The scene is still watchable. But the geometry of it is wrong in a way that a careful viewer would notice without necessarily being able to identify why. Let the cuts settle. Let the missing moments exist in the space between what you remember and what was actually there. Section 15. The McGucket swear heard around the world, or not. Of all the censored moments in Gravity Falls, the one involving Old Man McGucket in Society of the Blind Eye has a special place in fan lore because it's the only censored moment in the show that turns out, years later, to contain a joke that was specifically aimed at the censors themselves. The moment occurs when the gang discovers what the Society of the Blind Eye has been doing, systematically erasing the memories of Gravity Falls residents who have encountered supernatural phenomena, allegedly to protect them from the distress of those encounters, but in practice as a kind of control mechanism. McGucket, who has had more of his memories erased than anyone and has spent years living with the consequences of that erasure, reacts to this revelation with an outburst. The outburst is censored. His dialogue is replaced with a beeping tone, as if someone has hit a mute button over a curse word, and the show presents this as a gag. McGucket is so appalled that he's swearing, and the swear is bleeped for the audience. In the American broadcast, this plays as a joke about the censorship process itself. McGucket's swear is so perfectly timed, so clearly in response to something genuinely outrageous, that the bleeping feels like an acknowledgement of the show's own awareness of the restrictions it operates under. The joke is, we know something was said here, and so do you. And the bleep is the show winking at you. In certain international markets, the scene was cut entirely. The bleeping outburst was removed, presumably because even a bleeped outburst implies that a swear word was uttered, and that implication was considered too much for the intended audience. The joke vanished with it, but the real punchline to this story arrived years later, when The Book of Bill was published in 2023. The book contains a cipher called The Brothers' Secret Code, and fans quickly got to work applying that cipher to various elements of the show. When they applied it to McGucket's bleeping outburst in Society of the Blind Eye, specifically to the symbols that appear in the speech bubble containing his censored dialogue, the decoded message was, "Oh, Disney." McGucket's censored swear, the one that S&P bleeped, the one that certain international markets cut entirely, the one that generated a whole discussion about whether even a bleeped swear could appear in a children's show. That swear in the show's own secret language was "Oh, Disney." A direct address, a comment, a message from the creator to the corporation that was so thoroughly embedded in the show's own cryptographic system that it took 8 years and a companion book to decode it. Alex Hirsch hid the punchline inside the cut. He encoded the critique of the censors in the scene they censored. And then he waited for someone to find it. This is either the most patient joke in the history of animation, or the most elaborate, or both. Section 16. Not S&P approved. When the censors approved their own mockery. There is a scene in the Summerween episode, Summerween, which aired in Season 1, where a party flyer appears briefly on screen. This is background detail, the kind of thing that most viewers never notice consciously, but which the Gravity Falls production team filled with jokes and references for the small percentage of the audience that would pause the episode and look. The flyer, in Hirsch's original script, included the line, "Bottles will be spun," a reference to the kissing game, Spin the Bottle. S&P sent a note. The concern was that "Bottles will be spun" was too clearly a reference to Spin the Bottle, a game with implications of physical intimacy between participants. Please revise. Hirsch agreed to remove the line, but in its place he wrote 3 words, "Not S&P approved." As in, the thing that used to be on this flyer has been removed because the Standards and Practices Department found it inappropriate. The joke is right there, in the text, in the actual episode, announcing its own censorship to the small number of viewers who would ever pause and read it. S&P sent another note. They requested that "Not S&P approved" also be removed, because it was calling attention to the censorship process in a way that felt unauthorized and possibly a liability. The note asked for revision. Hirsch replied that he didn't see what the problem was. S&P went back and forth. And in the end, in what is either a moment of bureaucratic fatigue or a genuine decision that the joke was harmless, or simply someone at S&P having a rare sense of humor about the whole thing, S&P approved "Not S&P approved." The department approved their own mockery. The joke about the censored content remained in the episode, pointing to itself, pointing to the process, pointing at the invisible hand that was trying to shape the show. And then the episode aired, and it played in countries around the world, and children watched it and mostly didn't notice the flyer. And adults who did notice it smiled quietly to themselves, and Hirsch had won this small, strange, beautiful battle. The flyer in Summerween reads, "Not S&P approved," and S&P approved it. And now you know. Section 17. The Dippy Fresh Neck Snap, the deleted scene that never made it. Of all the deleted scenes from Gravity Falls that have become part of fan conversation over the years, the one involving Dippy Fresh has a quality of darkness that sets it apart from most of the others, because it involves a moment of graphic cartoon violence perpetrated by Dipper Pines himself, cheerful, nerdy, morally earnest Dipper, who spends the entire series trying to do the right thing and protect the people he loves. Dippy Fresh appears in the Season 2 episode Dungeons, Dungeons, and More Dungeons. Wait, no, Dippy Fresh appears in the Weirdmageddon 2 Escape from Reality episode, where Mabel has retreated into a fantasy bubble created by Bill Cipher. In the bubble, Mabel's world is everything she's always wanted. She's a famous celebrity, all her friends love her unconditionally, there's no pain or difficulty, and her replacement for Dipper, Dippy Fresh, a character who is enthusiastically supportive of everything Mabel does, relentlessly positive, and completely without any of the friction that comes with having an actual sibling relationship, exists as a kind of funhouse mirror version of Dipper's role in her life. Dippy Fresh is what you get when you replace a real relationship with a fantasy relationship, when you replace someone who challenges and complicates you with someone who just agrees with everything. Dipper encounters Dippy Fresh in the bubble and has a viscerally negative reaction to him. This is both funny, the idea that Dipper is genuinely annoyed by his own idealized replacement, and genuinely resonant. Because Dippy Fresh represents the fantasy that there's a version of things where relationships don't require effort or friction or growth, and the show is clearly arguing that this fantasy is corrosive, that Mabel's retreat into the bubble is a problem that needs to be addressed, not a comfort that should be preserved. In the version of the episode that aired, Dipper's hatred of Dippy Fresh is expressed through increasingly frustrated attempts to get Mabel to leave the bubble, with Dippy Fresh serving as a comic obstacle and a symbol of what's keeping her there. It's handled with the show's characteristic mixture of comedy and genuine emotional weight. In the original storyboards, as revealed by Jeff Rowe, a writer and director on the show, the scene went further, much further. In the deleted version, Dipper doesn't just try to argue with Dippy Fresh or find ways around him. Dipper grabs Dippy Fresh by the neck and snaps it, just kills him. Quickly, suddenly, without ceremony. Because Dippy Fresh is not a real person. He's a fantasy construct created by Bill Cipher's magic, something that exists only inside a bubble of unreality. And Dipper, who has spent the entire series dealing with things that are trying to hurt the people he loves, responds to this particular obstacle with an immediate and efficient physical solution. The scene was cut because it was deemed too violent for a children's show. And looking at it in isolation, that makes a certain amount of sense. A child character snapping another character's neck is not standard Disney content, regardless of the circumstances. But the decision to cut it changes something about the scene and about Dipper's character in that moment. The aired version of the episode keeps Dipper's frustration at a certain pitch of helpless exasperation. The deleted version suggests that Dipper has, over the course of dealing with supernatural horrors, developed a pragmatic relationship with violence that the main narrative of the show tends to shy away from acknowledging directly. Alex Hirsch later uploaded a storyboard version of the deleted scene to social media, which is how it became part of the broader fan conversation about the show. It exists in storyboard form, rough pencil drawings, the scene as it was planned, before the decision to cut it was made. And if you find it and watch it, the tone of it is genuinely striking. It's fast, it's casual, it's treated almost as a non-event by the scene itself. Dipper just handles the problem. No dramatic music, no build-up, just a quick snap and the scene moves on. Which is, in some ways, more unsettling than if it had been played dramatically, because the casualness suggests a competence that the show usually keeps hidden in Dipper, a willingness to take drastic action that the main narrative tends to soften. The Dippy Fresh neck snap exists in that storyboard. It is part of the show's history. It just never made it into your television. Section 18. Other major deleted scenes across both seasons. Beyond the Dippy Fresh scene, the list of deleted and cut material from Gravity Falls is genuinely extensive, and working through it has a certain meditative quality. Each lost scene is a window into a road not taken, a glimpse of a slightly different version of a show you thought you knew. From the very first episode, Tourist Trapped, there were scenes that didn't make the final cut. Nothing so dramatic as a neck snap, but rather the subtler losses that come from trimming a script to fit a time slot. Moments of character establishment that would have given you slightly more of the twins' relationship before the supernatural adventure began. Small details of the Mystery Shack's layout that would have expanded your sense of the space. The pilot episode had a detail that only became visible once the original uncut pilot leaked in 2024. A character in what would become the skull fracture bar scene had a tattoo reading "stab." In the broadcast version, that tattoo was changed to "bats." The letters rearranged, the potential for the word to carry any darkness quietly removed, and probably 99% of viewers never noticed either version consciously. From Into the Bunker, the second season episode introducing the shapeshifter, there were early storyboards showing a decontamination scene that, as one of the animators noted, would have ended more awkwardly between Dipper and Wendy. The shapeshifter bunker episode is already one of the densest emotional episodes of the series, dealing with Dipper's crush on Wendy, his fear of rejection, and his confrontation with something that can become anyone he loves. The deleted material would have added another beat of awkwardness to an episode that was already well calibrated on that particular emotional frequency. From A Tale of Two Stans, the extraordinary episode revealing the full history of Stan and Ford's relationship, which aired midway through Season 2 and fundamentally recontextualized everything that had come before. There were several deleted scenes documented in the complete series box set. In an early version of the ending of that episode, Ford returns to sleep in his own room. There, Bill Cipher appears before him and tells him directly that Stanley reactivating the portal will be of use to Bill soon. This deleted scene would have made explicit, at an earlier point in the season, that Bill was actively aware of the portal situation and planning to exploit it. Its removal means that the revelation of Bill's awareness comes later, more dramatically, in a context where it has more weight. Also from A Tale of Two Stans was a deleted scene, fully animated apparently, rather than just storyboarded, involving both Stan and Ford adjusting their glasses at the same time. The scene was included in a 2015 San Diego Comic-Con trailer for the second half of Season 2 and was never seen again. It's lost. Fully animated, briefly visible, then gone. The reason for its removal is not documented. It simply vanished between the trailer and the broadcast. A small moment of twin synchronicity that exists only in the memories of people who were watching that specific trailer in that specific year. From Society of the Blind Eye, the deleted scenes include a moment where one of the Society's members expresses concerns about the organization abusing its power. This is a character who, in the version of the episode that aired, is simply a faceless member of the cult. In the deleted version, they have a conscience. They notice what's happening, they say something, and then Blind Ivan erases everyone's memories so that the complaint can't be acted upon. The deleted scene would have added a layer of tragedy to the Society's operations, showing that the corruption wasn't universal, that someone inside the machine was uneasy, but that the machine's own mechanism for self-protection was too efficient to allow dissent to survive. The aired version presents a monolithic organization. The deleted version presents something more uncomfortably familiar. From Weirdmageddon 3, there was a planned epilogue episode. Not just a deleted scene, but an entirely separate episode that was conceived, planned, and ultimately not made. The concept involved Dipper and Mabel packing up the Mystery Shack at the end of summer, with Blendon Blandon arriving to warn them about time anomaly bubbles still floating around Gravity Falls. The twins fall into one of these bubbles and are transported back to the very first day they arrived in Gravity Falls, before the events of Tourist Trapped. They see themselves as they were on that first day, not excited to be there, not yet changed by everything that happened. And they understand in that moment how far they've come. The abandoned epilogue would have been the show watching itself from a distance, using its own time travel mythology to create a moment of reflection on its own journey. It would have been the show saying goodbye to itself. The decision not to make it means that Weirdmageddon 3 is the ending, the real ending. And the images of the twins driving away in the final moments of that episode carry all of the weight of farewell without any additional scaffolding, which is arguably better. But the other ending existed as a concept, was considered seriously enough to be planned, and its absence is one of those small ghosts that float around this show. Also from the Weirdmageddon arc, originally Gideon's gang was written as possessing rocket launchers, which they use on Dipper and Wendy during a chase sequence. In the aired version, the chase is dramatic, but the weaponry is somewhat more conventional. Rocket launchers are a difficult thing to include in a Disney animated show, and this particular cut has the same quality as many of the violence cuts. Not a conspiracy, just the practical limits of what the production could include while remaining nominally a children's show. And then there is the "We'll Meet Again" situation. Disney originally wanted to cut the song "We'll Meet Again" from the Weirdmageddon finale entirely because of how much it was costing to license Vera Lynn's recording. The song plays over one of the most emotionally devastating sequences in the entire series. Bill Cipher's transformation of the townspeople into screaming, stone-frozen human furnishings for his pyramid headquarters. The apocalypse at its height, everything wrong at once. And the choice to play a warm, nostalgic wartime ballad over imagery of total horror creates a tonal contrast that is genuinely one of the most sophisticated things the show does on a pure craft level. Hirsch fought to keep it. He won. The song stayed. And the sequence became the thing it is, something you can't really describe to someone who hasn't seen it, because it only exists in that particular combination of images and sound, and the specific way that combination lands. The song stayed. Not everything did. One more deleted scene deserves extended attention, because it involves the character arc of Bill Cipher in ways that would have fundamentally changed the mythology of the show's final act. In early plans for the plot following the opening of the interdimensional rift, the event that triggers Weirdmageddon, Bill was written as appearing before Ford in his room after Ford returns from the events of A Tale of Two Stans. In this deleted scene, Bill directly tells Ford that Stanley reactivating the portal has been of use to him and that his plans are advancing. This would have been the moment, mid-season, well before the Weirdmageddon arc, where the audience understood explicitly that Bill had been aware of and manipulating the portal situation all along. The decision to cut this scene changed the pacing of the season significantly. Without it, the reveal of Bill's awareness and agency comes later, during the actual Weirdmageddon episodes, at a point in the narrative where its weight is considerably greater because the situation has already deteriorated. The audience spends more time in the dark about Bill's true relationship to the portal, which means the moments of revelation hit harder. The cut was a pacing decision, not a censorship decision in the traditional sense. It was about narrative economy rather than content concerns. But it changed the shape of the story in ways that most viewers absorbed without realizing they'd been subtly redirected. There's also the matter of the alternate version of Weirdmageddon that was in early development, in which Gideon's gang had rocket launchers for the chase sequence. The detail is small about a chase scene is still a chase scene, but it points to an earlier version of Weirdmageddon that was perhaps more chaotically violent, more explicitly apocalyptic in its visual language. The rocket launchers suggest a production team that was initially willing to go quite far with the disaster movie quality of the dimensional apocalypse, and that subsequent choices, whether driven by budget, content concerns, or narrative refinement, pulled back towards something more contained. What we're doing in cataloging all of these deleted scenes and altered moments is something that mirrors what the show itself was always doing. We are finding the things that were hidden. We are uncovering what was behind the visible surface. We are treating the show as a mystery to be decoded, which is, of course, exactly what it invited us to do from its very first frame. When the cryptogram in the opening credits said, "Stan is not what he seems," and practically everyone missed it. The show is still doing it, even now, even when you think you know everything about it. There's something else. Another layer, another room under the room, another piece of correspondence that turns out to be relevant, another storyboard that surfaces somewhere, another fan who finds something in a frame they'd missed for years and posts about it, and the community lights up with the particular pleasure of recognition and discovery that Gravity Falls was specifically designed to produce. The song stayed. Not everything did, but enough stayed that the show is still giving things up if you ask it the right questions, still hiding things in plain sight, still saying 3 letters back in a reversed whisper at the beginning of the theme, waiting for you to decode it. 3 letters back. You know how. Section 19. What the censored version feels like against the real show. There are people in the world who only ever watched Gravity Falls in censored form. People who grew up in Southeast Asia and watched a version of the show where fireworks were pixelated and zombie head explosions were replaced with loops of zombies clutching their heads. People in Latin America who watched a version where Preston Northwest's screams were silent, where the word dead was replaced with the end of, where certain insults simply weren't there. People in India who, depending on when and how they accessed the show, saw a version where some of the Season 2 content was altered, or who saw the Disney Plus version with Stan's Fez symbol digitally erased. people in Kenya who never got to watch it at all. For these viewers, the show they know and love is a different show than the one Alex Hirsch made. It has the same characters, the same overall plot, the same cryptograms and coded messages and emotional beats. But it's slightly different in texture, like a photograph that has been scanned from a printed copy rather than from the original negative. The image is recognizably the same, but something very fine has been lost in the translation. What does this feel like from the inside? It's hard to say because most viewers don't know what they're missing. If you've only ever seen the version where the fireworks are pixelated, you don't experience the pixelation as a loss. You just experience fireworks that are blurry, which might seem like an animation choice or a broadcast artifact or nothing at all. If you've only ever seen the version where McGucket's outburst is cut entirely, you don't experience the cut as a wound in the scene. You just experience a scene without the outburst, which might seem completely normal. The awareness of what was removed requires access to multiple versions simultaneously, which is not something viewers typically have. It requires the kind of comparative attention that fans with internet access and time on their hands bring to things they love deeply. People who track down the original broadcasts, compare them to the streaming versions, document the differences in fan wikis, and gradually assemble the complete picture of everything that was changed and why. And when you do have that complete picture, when you can sit with all the versions at once, what you feel is not exactly grief. It's something more like the sensation of a room with a slightly lower ceiling than you expected. Nothing dramatic, nothing catastrophic, but a persistent awareness of a constraint that wouldn't have been there if the circumstances had been different. There's also something interesting about the relationship between these different versions and the show's own themes. Gravity Falls is, at its core, a show about the gap between what things appear to be and what they actually are. The Mystery Shack is a tourist trap, but it's also the location of a dimensional portal. Grunkle is a con man, but he's also a deeply devoted brother who spent 30 years trying to rescue the person he loved. Dipper is a nerdy kid solving mysteries, but he's also confronting patterns of obsession and manipulation that the show asks you to examine seriously. Everything in Gravity Falls has a layer under the layer you can see. And here is the show itself, with its own layer under the layer you can see. The broadcast version has a version underneath it, the intended version, the fought-over version, the version that lived in the scripts before the notes arrived. And that version has a version underneath it too. The deleted scenes, the scrapped concepts, the things Hirsch wanted to try and ultimately didn't. Layer under layer under layer. The show about hidden things has hidden things in it. The show about secrets is itself a secret, or at least has secrets inside it. Things that only reveal themselves to the people who look very carefully. You are looking very carefully. The uncensored show that lives in Alex Hirsch's scripts and storyboards and intentions is the same show you watched, mostly. But mostly is doing a lot of work in that sentence. And the parts that aren't mostly, the two old ladies in the diner, the zombie heads, the neck snap, the censored outburst that said, "Oh, Disney," those parts are not trivial. They're the parts where the show was trying to say something specific, something particular, something that required exactly the word or image or moment that got removed. And their absence creates a version of the show that is very good, genuinely great, one of the finest pieces of television animation ever made, but also slightly quieter than it intended to be. There is a version of this story in which the censorship made the show better, in which the resistance of the S and P process forced Hirsch and his team to be more creative, to find solutions that were more elegant than the direct approach, to encode meaning in ways that were richer and more layered than the plain statement would have been. The Kentucky Limerick is an example of this. The substitution became its own joke, better than what it replaced. The not S&P approved flyer is another example. The evidence of censorship became the punchline, funnier than what it was replacing. The Blubs-Durland relationship, forced into subtext by the network's restrictions, became something that fans engaged with deeply and emotionally in a way that explicit representation might not have achieved. The constraints produced art, but you have to hold that alongside the other truth, which is that constraints also produce loss. The two old ladies didn't get to kiss. McGucket's swear was bleeped and cut in the markets that couldn't even handle the bleep. Dippy Fresh's neck snap, whatever you think about whether it should have been in the show, represents a version of Dipper that the audience never got to see, a version that had absorbed the darkness of everything he'd been through and was capable of responding to it directly and without ceremony. Both things are true. The constraints produced art, and the constraints produced loss. And sitting with that dual truth in the quiet of this late hour is part of what it means to love something that was made inside a system that wasn't entirely on its side. Section 20. The Legacy. What Alex Hirsch's fight means for animation. The story of Gravity Falls and censorship is ultimately a story about what happens when a creator who cares very deeply about a piece of work encounters a corporate structure that cares about the work primarily as an asset to be managed and protected. These two ways of caring are not the same, and the friction between them produces all of the material we've covered in this video. The emails, the cuts, the deleted scenes, the retroactive erasures, the international alterations, the slow negotiation of every word and image and implication. What makes the Gravity Falls story different from most similar stories is not that the creative person won. They didn't, entirely. Hirsch lost the two old ladies in the diner. He had things changed without his knowledge when Disney Plus launched. He had the specific vision of what the show could be persistently trimmed and modified and softened over the course of 4 years. He didn't win in any absolute sense. What makes the story different is that he made it visible. He documented the fight. He kept the emails. He waited. Not forever, but long enough. And then on the 10th anniversary of the show, he opened the archive. He let the public see the actual shape of what the creative process looks like when it collides with institutional control. And because the show is good enough and loved enough and significant enough that people pay attention, the documentation matters. It becomes part of the permanent record. The impact of this visibility is real. When you're a young animator, or a young writer, or a young showrunner trying to make something with complexity and integrity inside a corporate environment, having a documented record of what that fight looks like, what the notes actually say, what the pushback actually costs, what you can actually win, is useful. It demystifies a process that is often kept invisible, not out of malice, but out of institutional instinct. Corporations don't want their internal negotiations to be public. The fact that these ones are public, that Hirsch made them public, and the Hollywood Reporter covered them and the internet read them means something. It also means something for the shows that came after. The Owl House, created by Dana Terrace, who worked as a storyboard artist on Gravity Falls, has a queer main protagonist in an explicitly romantic relationship, something that is significantly more visible than anything Gravity Falls was allowed to show. The Owl House faced its own censorship battles and was ultimately canceled before its planned conclusion. But what it achieved in terms of representation on a Disney-owned platform is visibly more than what Gravity Falls achieved, and the path from one show to the other runs in part through the very public documentation of what the Gravity Falls fight cost and what it yielded. Alex Hirsch left Disney after Gravity Falls ended and signed a deal with Netflix. He has been able to work in a different institutional context since then with different constraints and different freedoms. The show he made at Disney, the compromised, fought-over, imperfect, but extraordinary version, is the show the world got. And it was enough. More than enough, arguably. The show that made it through the process is better than most things that never faced those constraints at all. There is also something worth saying about the 10-year anniversary video specifically. The decision to release the emails 10 years after the show premiered was not random. It came at a moment when Disney was actively trying to claim cultural credit for the show's queer representation, promoting it as pride content on Disney Plus while, as Hirsch pointed out, having spent years actively preventing that representation from existing. The timing of his response was deliberate. He waited until the hypocrisy was visible and then he documented it, making it harder to maintain the fiction that Disney had supported the show's values all along. This is a form of accountability that the entertainment industry rarely provides for itself. Showrunners who fight with networks typically stay quiet about it, because speaking out has professional costs and because there's rarely much institutional memory to hold the corporation responsible for what happened years ago. Hirsch spoke out anyway, And in doing so, he created a document that belongs not just to fans of Gravity Falls, but to anyone trying to understand how creative work gets made inside corporate structures and what the true cost of that making actually is.